Here we are again with another week of Record Live, and it's lovely to be joined by a special guest this morning. But first of all, Zanita, it was great to see you on the weekend at the Digital Discipleship Conference. We've talked about that on the show a couple of weeks back with Jared Madden, but also now it's actually happened, and it was fantastic. How was it, Zanita? Did you enjoy it?
It was. I thought it was great. There was a bit of a kerfuffle beforehand with change of venues from the cyclone and everything, but it all came together and it was really fun. Met all the new people and I felt really inspired.
Awesome. Very good.
Just a little fun fact. I don't know if you know, there's actually a pig conference happening straight after us at Digital Discipleship, so should have stayed.
Pig conference. If we'd stayed, we could have cast all the pigs into the ocean. There's quite a cliff on the beach at the Gold Coast at the moment, so it could have been a biblical event. Moving to our special guest now, Enno. Enno is a colleague from the Adventist Review, based in North America. The Adventist Review has been around in the Adventist Church since before the Adventist Church was officially called the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and you would say it's a flagship publication of the church. It's been around for a very long time. Enno is the News and Communication Director for Adventist Review, and he's been spending a couple of days down under. You've come to the Digital Discipleship Conference. You've spent some days in the office with us, and it's just really good to spend time with a communications news colleague from around the globe and hear about what Adventist Review is doing, what Record's doing. So welcome to Australia. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you this week.
It's wonderful to be here. I also had a wonderful time at the Discipleship Conference, and not oddly enough, but I even took some notes, and there's some great presentations that I want to take back some of those suggestions back to North America and see if we can implement some of the great presentations that were presented.
And that's the beauty of, I guess, cross-pollination of ideas, having opportunity to work with colleagues from around the world. Because we don't always get it right in our own little area, but it's great to have that opportunity to learn and to grow. Today, we're going to talk about news. Now, I've been in Adventist Record for a very long time. I may look youthful, but I'm getting on a bit. And the reality is, sometimes I've come across this impression, this attitude in the church that the church should stick to mission, and news is a little bit like, why? Why do they do it? Why do they have people employed to do that? Wouldn't the budgets be better going to sort of pastors? And that's quite a big question to unpack today, but perhaps we can start having a think about it and see where we get to. Enno, what do you think?
I think news is highly fascinating. If you consider out of all of the Protestant denominations, we're the only one that's global. So we might not be the largest in mere numbers, but we are the only one that's global left out of the Protestant movement. Now, I think there's multiple reasons for this, but I've wrestled with this question: what keeps us united as a church? And I think, of course, I don't want to minimize the idea that we have the belief structure, and we have our 28 fundamental beliefs, and we have the idea of the three angels message and the imminence of the return of the second coming. So I don't want to minimize that. But on the other hand, I think one of the things that really unites us beyond the idea of our belief and our structure in that sense is the fact of being able to share stories. I think those of us that grew up in the church will have heard stories from the Mission Spotlight, for example.
Yes. Yep.
I remember when I grew up in Germany, that was, and that dates me at this point, unfortunately. But I remember the carousels, the actual slides, before it actually went into the video production. But it was an idea that we had a window to be able to see Adventism outside of the mere small, narrow focus of our local congregation. Now, there's nothing wrong with our local congregation. I don't want to minimize that either, because I think ministry happens there. But it is the beauty about Adventism is that we can go, for example, like me right now. I have the opportunity to be here in Australia, and I'm here amongst brothers and sisters, people that have the same faith. And it's a beauty that we can actually travel and still have that extended faith family. And news stories help us.
The news helps to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that story is often really overlooked. And I think it's true what you're saying, like you go to another country and you can just go to another church and all of a sudden it feels like you've still got family across the globe. But I guess just to clarify, would you say that's like the main goal of these publications is to maintain this connectedness around the globe?
Yeah, I think publications in general. I mean, I think so. For years, I worked even with a union publication, and I think even there, the idea is how do we keep our church members informed, and how do we keep them engaged in the church? And I think and so I used to work in a smaller geographical territory. Now, in the last couple of years, I've had the opportunity to work more on the global scale. But again, I think the passion is and the drive is. To help our members understand and maybe not feel as isolated. Even in the last place that I lived, I used to be able to go on Sabbath to different churches, and typically the churches I went to were more the smaller churches, where you have a pastor with multiple churches, and then I would receive an invitation to preach or something of that nature. And I feel sometimes when you're in a smaller church, or if you are remotely, physically in a more remote location, you may not feel part of the overarching church altogether. And I think this is where this is where sharing news. Hey, you're not alone in this. You're not just the 10, 15 faithful followers here, but you're connected to a whole host of other people that have similar views and similar ideas and beliefs as you. They may not be 100% the same because we have different cultures, we have different languages, so we express some things a little bit differently. But I think that's the beauty about being able to work in the idea in publication where and even in video dissemination of news, it doesn't just have to be in the print form, but that's the beauty of, I think, being able to pull our church a little bit closer, and those people that feel a little bit marginalized can be pulled in to the greater community of the Adventist Church.
I think also what Jared shared at Digital Discipleship, he was talking about sharing our stories, not just the ones that we've overcome, but the ones that we're still in the middle of and are still struggling with, and how we are kind of holding on to faith in those times. I know that our publications in Australia do share testimonies as well, and they share people's struggles. And so I think those stories can also, you can see someone the other side of the world struggling with the same thing and have that sense of I'm not alone even more.
It really builds up that community. Enno, we'll smash some myths today, I reckon. One of the things that I think holds people back sometimes, Adventists have this interesting relationship with pride. We don't want to be proud. We don't want to necessarily promote ourselves and blow our own trumpet. And that's potentially a healthy thing if, we're looking at pride of self and lifting ourselves up above other people. But I also find that sometimes churches, individuals don't like to share the news about what they're doing because they're like, A, it won't be significant enough to go to a higher level of the church in the publications world, or B, I shouldn't be proud of that. I shouldn't promote myself over and above. It's just PR. It's just over and above everyone else. Why? What argument would you give to someone who said that? How would you explain to them that perhaps the news purpose is a little different? It's a little more nuanced as to why they should share their stories.
Sure. I think one, on the news side, I know, Zenita, you talked a little bit about profiles and testimonies, but let me maybe veer a little bit more to in covering an event or something that's maybe a little bit more newsy. If you do news as news, it's not as, and you can add opinion into that by using quotes and quoting people, but you don't necessarily, you're not boastful in what you write.
Yes.
I actually have seen, and these are the stories that I, in the past and even currently, really like, personally speaking. Now, I know everybody has their personal preferences, but I like when I see a church doing something innovative, something that I haven't seen somewhere else. And all of a sudden, to me, what I find interesting about this is not just that it was done, But my mind works then in how can I replicate that in my local congregation or in my contextual environment that I live in. And I think that's where the news is more than just saying, hey, look at what I've done. It's an ability to say, here's what we tried. And I think, Zenita, you also mentioned what I appreciate. We can sometimes also talk about things that didn't go well or as well. And we can say, hey, we did something. We tried this. Some of it worked. Some of it may not have worked. But it allows us to think more creatively. I think it's very easy for us to fall into patterns in ministry even and just repeat the same thing over and over again. And by being able to see, and news does this, and sharing stories about what other people do, it allows us to be creative in our approach to ministry in our local congregation.
I love that answer, because that's a similar answer to the one I would give, like innovation, inspiration, actually giving people encouragement, like, oh, I could do that in my local area. I've seen that happen with stories we've published in the record, where churches have started whole ministries around what a story or an article they've read, and then it's actually transformed their community. So it's like multiplying the effect. It's passing on the effect and the impact.
I have a bit of a curious question, Enno. I'm sure, being the editor and the comms director, you are very passionate about this. You obviously are very passionate about news and stories and so on. But do you have any memories or experiences where this really hit home and you were like, wow, this is so important? Like, whether it was a reaction someone had to something being printed, or a response, or just your own experience with the magazine? Throwing you on the spot.
You're putting me on the spot. And I'm wrestling a little bit with coming up with a really, really good example. I mean,
Yeah, sure.
to be honest, it's always fascinating to me to read letters that we receive. And when you actually have people that will respond to some material. I think we all, those of us that are on content creation, and content creation is I'm using that very intentional, because that's much beyond just the written idea. Like, that could be if you're a content creator on social media, or if you create videos, or whatever content you're creating. Sometimes the challenge is you don't necessarily get feedback. So when you do, it's actually really, and sometimes we do get also the feedback that is less than pleasant, and sometimes actually very needed, right? Because sometimes we miss the mark on something, or we portrayed something, or we featured a story, or we wrote a story ourselves, and we missed a perspective of an event, and somebody comes back and says, we missed the fact that you missed this opportunity to share X, Y, Z. And I think there's always validity in being able to get feedback like that as well. I'm trying to think, though, in the idea of what I don't have a concrete example, unfortunately, right now on top of my head, of one particular event or a story that has happened. But I did, and just yesterday, was thinking about an article that I read. So what the way my work, the way we do news and the Adventist Review, we actually curate a lot of news. So we do some news generation ourselves, but it's a fraction compared to what we curate from the World Church. And for me, I get to read and I get to see into the different countries and the different territories. And there are sometimes articles that stand out much more to me than others. And so yesterday, I think I was mentioning Ashley, one of the writers here at Adventist Record, actually wrote a piece, a commentary piece, on introvert. This is several years back, on being an introvert and how to do ministry. And I remember like this article still, after reading hundreds and hundreds of articles every single year. Years later, this article still stands out in my mind, that it actually deeply and touched me, because it was something atypical, and it was well written, it was well thought through, and I incredibly deeply appreciated tackling a subject that was maybe not as common. And so there's some of those things that sometimes stand out. And I think for each one of us, that might be a little bit different articles, different topics reach out to us. But that's one over the years that actually really stood out in my mind.
I like that.
So, Adventist Review, tell us a little bit about the news at Adventist Review. Like, what does that involve? What are you doing? I know you've got some stats per year, how many stories you're getting out and where they're coming from and how that sort of works. Just pull back the curtain a little bit and tell us what your job involves in the news space of like gathering that information. Where do the stories come from? How do they get spread? And yeah, and obviously the Adventist World we haven't really mentioned either, but that's one vehicle that they can go around the world. But there's also websites and things. But yeah, how do you gather and spread the news?
So maybe I'll just piggyback off of where you ended. In the Adventist Review team, we work on two primary publications. Adventist Review, which is the legacy ministry of sorts, which was founded by James White. It existed before the church formally was organized. So that magazine used to be very instrumental in the church and shared and was trying to bind the flock together is the terminology that was even used. So that was the idea, like, hey, how do we keep the church together? And as we know, Adventism comes from Battle Creek, Michigan, from that geographical area. So we find our heritage, even though I grew up in a different country and you're here in Australia. The formation and foundation of Adventism is in America. And so Adventist Review grows from within North America, and Adventist Review kind of stays for many years a little bit more of a North American centric publication. And then in 2000, I believe it was 2006, Jan Paulson, the president of the General Conference at the time, had the vision of how do we communicate with the world church? And this is the birth of Adventist World, the magazine that goes around the globe. It has a pretty good distribution. As of last year, we had a monthly distribution of 1.4 million magazines a month. And so it has a pretty broad reach and is translated into all kinds of different languages. That has advantages and it has disadvantages because we can't be as narrow, as specific, and as geographically relevant, perhaps, as sometimes the more geographically narrow magazines like the Adventist Record or the Union magazines or the country magazines that we see in Europe and so on. But when it comes to what we do on the news side, you asked that question as well. We try to be fairly engaged because there's great work that is being done in all of our divisions. We try to regularly update our website. And so we have in the past published 17 stories a week that we've curated from different parts of the world and where we share just a story about what's happening. And as you can imagine, because of language, culture, and time zones and all of that, sometimes it gets a little bit more tricky to get stories from other places of the world. But nevertheless, the intent is to be reflective of the world church and to distribute stories from across the world church.
That was going to be my next question, was what's the with all these different magazines? So thank you for answering that. I feel like it's clarified that. But I guess something that we, probably Jared can speak to this a little bit more, is struggle with it with the record and science is sometimes there's issues that are really important that people want to hear about and know about more, but that are very controversial. How do you go with these? Because obviously, especially Adventist World is going around various different cultures and countries. And so that's probably even more difficult. How do you manage that? Like, do you still speak about them, or are there things that you just avoid, or what's your kind of rule of thumb there?
Well, it's not my problem because it's not in the news. So that's my editorial team. I can't speak on that. No, I'm happy to give you an insight. It is in our team, we have the more editorial focused team and we have the news team. So there's a little bit of a difference there. But and your point is well taken. There is an ability where we do listen to, especially to division leaders. So this would be, typically the three officers. They also come by our offices more frequently, just because there's regular meetings that they have at the General Conference. So we take the opportunity at times to listen to what feedback they give from us. So that's very pivotal because, as you can imagine, trying to cover the globe and the nuances of all the different issues that exist is quite complex. And so sometimes there's an idea of the traveling staff within the General Conference that will give us feedback, or our administration, where they say, hey, we see this being an acute topic that is being wrestled with in the church. How can we address this? Now, it becomes tricky because in some senses, we don't want to just approach it always from one angle or one culture. So especially Adventist Review, because it's more North America centric, is in some senses a little bit easier maybe to create content for, because it's for, I mean, even there, every country has its complexity, and with the migration, world migration, that has to be considered as well. But again, I would argue that our Adventist Review is a little bit easier to work with, because you're dealing with with a country or with a handful of countries that have a similar mindset. When you go to the Adventist World publication, on the editorial side, it becomes infinitely more complicated because the church is complicated. It's not simple. The issues that exist in Nepal are different than in Germany. They're different in the UK than they are in Peru. The church is just facing different influences. And this is, I think, one of the things where we need to just be honest. I think as a church, we are influenced by the culture that we're around. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a negative thing, but I think that's just a reality of the challenges. So when we create content, how do we create content that's culturally relevant to the whole globe? That's a very difficult task to be able to hit. And I would mention, we try our best to be, a curation of authors, to think broadly and to utilize the global network. And so we intentionally go out of our way to acquire authors that are outside of the North American division. So because we're located in North American division, it's always easier to go into your own backyard and get the authors. So we intentionally look beyond North America to see who could actually contribute on a given topic, on the theme that we're looking at doing, who could actually add some substance to this conversation that is maybe not just the things that we have within our backyard.
I feel like I know you've answered a difficult question carefully, which is good, always good. But it seems like in some ways you've addressed the sort of any maybe theological controversies, or maybe more the features side. What about bad news, reporting bad news? What's the responsibility of a church employee, especially a church organization that's official, that's employed by the church to represent the church? How do we approach bad news? Because I think just not putting anything that's ever bad news in is not the way to go. Maybe you think differently, but how do we approach bad news?
I feel like I'm going from one difficult topic to the next difficult topic. No, it's a very valid point. I mean, not everything is always sunny within the church. It's not always. There's conflicts that happen. I dealt with this much more when I was at the conference level. There is the crisis. There's a whole field that we in communication work on, which is called crisis communication. And that is when things don't go well in the church, be it with our church members, be it with conflicts within the church, be it even more egregious things where you have embezzlement, if you have when you have people that misstep and abuse members, be it member to member, be it employee to members, be it pastors or whoever you have. Unfortunately, those are stories that do exist, and I think there's a place to address some of those things. I think when I've reflected, where is the place for the Adventist World magazine, for example, or for us to deal with this? As much as on a personal, professional level, I love crisis communication, and it's something I miss engaging with. I'm not sure for upholding our church member that it is necessarily helpful to deal with crisis. If we would talk about all the crises, I could fill every issue with just crisis, with bad news. And I think what we've kind of determined in the Adventist Review and amongst the Adventist Review staff, which then impacts the Adventist World magazine, is that we want to create a magazine that is uplifting and encouraging for church members. And some of these challenges of the crisis are very complex situations where we can't go into enough detail. And sometimes we're even restricted. I mean, from a communication perspective, we're sometimes restricted, be it through labor laws of the various regions of the world where we can disclose more or less. And so sometimes we can't even completely disclose why we terminated an employee. And I know that creates angst and anxiety. And sometimes there's the question, is the church doing the right thing? And we have sometimes gotten it wrong. And I think this is why we have the governing structure of the church that is holding our leadership accountable. So the executive committee on the various different levels of our church. We also have a process that, that we have, the church, the conference, the union, the division, and then the general conference, that there is some kind of way that administratively we can deal with discrepancies. But when it comes to specifically the Adventist Review, we have made a conscious decision not to dive into so much the employment issues. If there's, for example, a termination of an employee, because one, in the global church with the vast number of employees we have, we could
fill the whole issue with
fill that.
I guess if it was the general conference president, that would be world newsworthy, but you're saying we don't go into all the nitty-gritty around the place.
And I think there's been moments when even the Adventist Review has ventured into this, and even historically, where it actually has taken a position when absolutely necessary.
Yes.
Case in point was during the Falkenberg era.
Yes.
The Adventist Review did do an investigative journalism piece about trying to create some clarity amongst the confusion of the situation that transpired at that time. So I think there are moments, but we try to be very, very specific when and where we cover that.
I think I can predict Zanita's next question, but Zanita, take it away.
I don't know. I'm not sure if you can, but I just wanted to touch on something. This was spoken about at Digital Discipleship a little bit, and it was the pressure that publications are under, not just because people trust publications less, because people are typically trusting their peers and people that have similar opinions more, but also just having to pump out more and more information and articles and stories and so on, because there's just so much out there, and having to be present on all of these different social media platforms as well. Is that something that you're experiencing at Adventist Review? Just forgot the publication for a second. And is this something that like individuals and church members can like get on board with? Like, are they encouraged to kind of submit things and send things, or do you just have a team of people who are kind of working, doing that, getting the stories, writing the things?
Good question. So I'll start with the team size. On our team, surprisingly enough, we are not that big on the news side. Even though we push out quite a bit of volume, we have 4 of us, and not all of us are full-time. I'm actually the only full-time employee that works on news. So we work with part-time employees to be able to aggregate the news and then to collect some of that. Remind me but I missed the first, I forgot the first part of the question.
I was just asking if you were kind of under the pressure of the pump with a lot of other publications in terms of like having to, like, are readers demanding more and more? Are they trusting you less, or have you
I think you're
there?
absolutely right. I think that's a challenge. I would urge maybe our Adventist readers to keep in mind, from what I have experienced and what I've seen within the church, when it comes to our Adventist church publications, and this is not just the Adventist Review, there's an actual editorial board, there's an actual process that goes through. It's not so simple to just say, hey, I'm going to randomly put something up and it's just going to be my opinion and so on. There's an actual process. So in our case, we have Marcos Pesaggi, who works on news aggregation, and he also writes some news. We have a copy editor. We have somebody that uploads our content, and then I work as a news editor, both more on the editorial, on the edit side, but also on the curation side, and determine what news we might want to pick up, or in building relationships with entities. But there's a process in all of this, is what I want to. It's not just random. It's not just, hey, I feel frustrated with the church today, so I'm going to write something that is going to be negative towards the church. There's a process, and I think some of the other entities. And this is the challenge that we're facing as the church publications of sorts, where other entities are a little bit more agile, perhaps, and they write whatever they feel. And it's this combination of news and commentary and their reflection. And I would say they don't necessarily, at least my experience and my what I've been able to observe, is their process is a little bit different and maybe not as rigid as it is within the church. Now, one of the things you also, I think, asked the question of how do we look for or deal with new submissions and that kind of thing. We are always grateful to be able to get stories pitched to us. But ultimately, I think the way this works really, really beautifully, stories work really well on the local geographical area really well. So if you have a story and you have a union paper, or if you have a paper like the Adventist Record, it's really, really great if you pitch that to that. We end up partnering with the publications and sometimes scour their websites, and sometimes get stories pitched to us. And so we have this within the church, I think, the system where there's this element of news can organically go to your local region, and then like the other regions we pay attention to what's happening at the conference level, at the union level, and we are constantly looking like what interesting news is happening. And so we are always intrigued by the news that is created and that happens at the local church, because again, like I said in the beginning, I think where ministry really happens. Yes, we had a wonderful conference at the Gold Coast just here over the weekend, but where ministry happens day in, day out, week after week, is the local church. And that's where the stories, in my opinion, really are. The really wonderful, juicy, good stories, they happen at the local church. And those are the stories that I think all of us that work in Adventist publications are just kind of are yearning to be able to get our hands on.
Well, I'll take Zanita's question then, since she didn't catch my handball. We like to get practical here on Adventist Live, and what can someone who's watching this, maybe they're not a news writer, maybe they found it interesting, the topics today, and they're a reader of Adventist Record, Adventist Review, different publications, but what can they do this week that can actually contribute to their faith, their church, to God's work in the world? What can they do? Is there something they can do?
I think there's two things. I encourage you to read what happens in other churches, in other countries, because you may gain, as we mentioned earlier, you may gain some really creative, really cool ideas that you didn't think about before. And so don't hesitate to look beyond your community, look beyond what is happening outside of your union conference union, your country, and see what is happening. And be inspired. Even if it doesn't necessarily apply to you, see the faithfulness of our brothers and sisters that are faithfully living out their faith. And that, I think that's one thing. There's a beauty of just engrossing yourself with the news that is happening worldwide. And so I think there's beauty in being able to and then I think that also opens our eyes, both from a personal perspective, but also from an Adventist perspective, to realize, hey, the world is bigger than my country. And especially in a culture, in the Western cultures where populism, the political populism is at a rise, and where we're more nationalistic focused, we are a global movement. And the global stories from our brothers and sisters across the globe can be uplifting to ourselves. But beyond that, I think there's the beauty of we all, many of us at least, and, the smartphone adoption rate is incredibly high. You all have tools tools that journalists were itching for 15 years ago. Everyone now has in their pocket. You have a device that can actually take phenomenal pictures. Take a few pictures of your next church event. That's a little bit creative. That is a little bit different. That you're doing. That is reaching the community. Take a few pictures. Take some B-roll footage or some video footage of like just what actually is happening. And all you have to do is write down 2-3 paragraphs, maybe get a quote by one person that attended the event and just ask them one question or a handful of questions that just ask, what did you enjoy about this? What did you like? Write those things down. It's pretty simple. Submit it. And yes, we would be happy to get that. And we're always happy to, I'm pretty sure you guys are happy to take that content, refine it a little bit, edit it, maybe move a few pieces around. And all of a sudden, we have a wonderful story from your local congregation.
Definitely. And I think the other thing we can all do is share content that we're reading. I think we often read our content for our own edification, but you never know who's reading your social media channel. So with that, I'll just segue to say, if you've enjoyed today's conversation, please share it with your networks. Please share it however you've watched it or listened to it. You can share it in many different places. But Enno, you're about to head back to the States at some point. We're hoping to facilitate you getting to at least cuddle a koala or something before you leave. But you're heading back tomorrow. We just pray God's blessing on the Adventist Review team and yourself, and safe travels. And for all of our regular Record Live family, we'll see you again next week. God bless.
Thanks, Enno. It's been good.
Thank you for having me.